All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is 1 p.m. on the east coast of the US, so it is C-Star time. My name is Hickok Christensen, and I'm happy to welcome our in-person and online audience to today's presentation. But before hearing from today's speaker, I want to alert you to our talk in 2 weeks' time, which will be given by Dr. Bill Hula from the University of Pittsburgh on a comparative effectiveness trial of feature generation in semantic feature analysis treatment for naming impairment in aphasia. So make sure to mark your calendars. Today, however, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Greg Hickok. Dr. Hickok's work is well known to most of our audience. He is a distinguished professor of cognitive sciences and language science at the University of California, Irvine, where he also serves as chair of the Department of Language Science. He received his PhD in psychology from Brandeis University in 1991 and completed postdoctoral training in cognitive neuroscience at MIT and the Salk Institute. Dr. Hickok joined the faculty at UC Irvine in 1996, where he was the founding director of the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience and is the founder and current director of the Center for Language Science. His research centers on the neurobiology of language and its relation to other brain systems using integrative multi-method approaches to understand how the brain enables speech perception, production, and communication. And his work has profoundly shaped current models of language processing in the brain. He is the editor-in-chief of Psychonomic Bulletin and Review and author of The Myth of Mirror Neurons, The Real Neuroscience of Communication and Cognition. And he also authored the recently published book, Wired for Words, The Neural Architecture of Language. And today, he'll share some of his work under the same title, Wired for Words, The Neural Architecture of Language and its Sensorimotor Foundation. So, please feel free to write your questions in the chat during the presentation for Dr. Hickok to answer at the end of his talk. And with that, I'll give the floor over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Sigfus, for that nice introduction. And I'm always happy to talk to the C-Star audience and some of my colleagues there who I see regularly. So welcome, thank you. All right, so I am going to be talking about one aspect of the work that I presented in this book, particularly the idea that there is a sensorimotor foundation for the neural architecture of language. This is a bit controversial, but I hope to uncontroversialize it for you, at least for some, in many respects today. If we have time at the end, I also want to talk a little bit about lateralization, so we'll see how we go. So let me just jump right in. For those of you who have to leave early or just want the punchline first, here it is. Early models of the neural architecture of language were sensorimotor based, and then linguistics, generative linguistics came on the scene in the 1950s and 60s and changed all that, and there was a large-scale rejection of sensorimotor based accounts of the neural architecture of language. I'm going to argue that the evidence supports an integrated linguistic sensorimotor model, which is what I'm going to be arguing for. Okay, so let's just go back and I'll review the status going back to the early days, where coming out of the neurological tradition, aphasia and language-brain organization was understood in terms of sensorimotor models. So it was all about the systems involved in controlling speaking and the systems involved in understanding. And of course, these models were proposed initially by Wernicke, kind of got lost for a while in the intervening decades, and then in the 60s, Geschwin revived them. And they worked pretty well. And then, like I said, generative linguistics came around, and Jakobson was one of the early proponents of these ideas and wrote a chapter, actually, called Aphasia as a Linguistics Problem. And there he argued, to quote, if aphasia is a language disturbance, then any description and classification of aphasic syndromes must begin with the question of what aspects of language are impaired in the various species of such a disorder. He proposed two operations, linguistic operations, one called selection and the other combination. So selection, and these applied at different levels, linguistic levels. So the idea is that you select phonemes or you select morphemes, and then you combine them into words and to phrases. That was his view, and he talked about the relevance of these ideas in aphasia, again with another quote from the same paper. The question of which of these two operations is chiefly impaired proves to be of far-reaching significance in describing, analyzing, and classifying the diverse forms of aphasia. This dichotomy is perhaps even more suggestive than the classical distinction between emissive and receptive aphasia. So he's essentially rejecting the idea that we should be talking about that we should be talking about a sensory motor function, sensory listening, motor producing, and promoted the view that we were to think about language deficits in terms of overarching abstract deficits at linguistic levels, where the overarching is over receptive and expressive abilities. So that was the linguistic perspective, and a lot of people were interested in this. People, notably at the Boston VA, which was an epicenter for aphasia research at the time, looked into these ideas extensively. Harold Goodclass and another young researcher named Edgar Zuref, who happened to be my PhD advisor, um, uh, uh, worried about the problem of Broca's aphasia because it didn't quite fit. So here's Edgar talking about the problem with respect to Jakobson's idea that is presented by Broca's aphasia. He wrote, routine clinical examinations generally suggest that damage to the frontal area of the left hemisphere, Broca's area, disrupts the ability of patients to produce speech much more than their ability to comprehend. Such patients, Broca's aphasics, often seem to fully understand commands and questions and appear to know what they want to say, yet can only produce short, labored, agrammatic utterances. So he was pointing out the problem that these syntactic deficits only seem to emerge in expressive function and not in receptive function. And I want to emphasize that the focus turned to syntax. And there was good reason for that because Chomsky was also on the scene and very active at the time, as he remained for the next multiple decades, promoting the idea that syntax was a very important, in fact, probably the most interesting and core aspect of human language. And so there was much interest in understanding syntax in the brain. And so given that you had a disorder that looked like a deficit in syntax on the expressive side, that is agrammatism, there was much interest in trying to see whether this was a generalized deficit that also affected receptive function. This was studied and reported on in a famous paper with Karamatsa and Zuref, the 1976 paper, where they studied the comprehension abilities of people with agrammatic Broca's aphasia. And I'm showing here the critical graph from the paper. It's worth reading this paper if you haven't read the original. So this is a sentence picture matching task, and they had two types of sentences. They actually had several types of sentences, but these are the critical ones. Those that were syntactically complex and semantically constrained, so something like the apple that the boy is eating is red, versus semantically reversible, where you didn't have any semantic cues regarding who was doing what to whom and what the predicate adjective referred to, such as the cat that the dog is biting is black. And here's the data. So this is percent correct, 50%, 100%. The dotted line here is Broca's aphasics. This is Wernicke's aphasics, conduction aphasics. We'll come back to that. Notice that this is the data point here showing performance on semantically constrained, which is not quite 100%, but pretty darn good at around 90% on average. When you remove the semantic constraint, performance drops to chance, essentially, which is the critical result. So this was interpreted as a dissociation, as the title of the talk, title of the paper indicated, a dissociation between heuristic, that is kind of semantically reasoning through the problem, versus algorithmic, that is applying some syntactic algorithm. You're seeing this dissociation. They concluded that it appears that the presumed dissociation between language production and comprehension does not hold for Broca's aphasics. The present analysis of their comprehension skills suggests that such patients are as impaired in comprehension as they are in production. So this solved the Broca's aphasia problem and justified Jakobson's approach to aphasia as a linguistics problem. And this kicked off much subsequent work on agrammatism and which persists to today. But was the problem really solved? And I'm going to argue that it wasn't. Many, many problems remained and remain today. And I'll highlight four of them, I think. The first one is that the focus was on the syntactic level. But of course, people with non-fluent aphasia have other kinds of problems too that are lower level. So phonological problems and motor speech problems. This was still asymmetric, even in the original study. So maybe if Karamatsa and Zurov were right, that solved the problem at the syntactic level, but it didn't solve the expressive-receptive differences at the sub-morphosyntactic level. So, and we do see this asymmetry persisting today, where receptive function at the motor speech or at the phonological level is better than expressive speech. And you see this across a bunch of different conditions, including severe Broca's aphasia, where their word comprehension is reasonably good, even if they're having trouble producing words at all. You see it in cerebral palsy, where individuals never have the opportunity to learn the motor speech aspects. They seem to comprehend words and process speech sounds fine. Same in opercular syndrome, in WADA studies, in infants, where you see their receptive abilities outstrip their production abilities. You even see it in chinchillas, who are quite good at perceiving speech. So this is all evidence against a kind of motor theory of speech perception, and this was something that I dealt with extensively in my earlier book. I'm not going to dwell on it today. The second problem is that expressive and receptive agrammatisms dissociate. So Karamatsa and Zurov showed that people with expressive agrammatism have some receptive agrammatism as well. But there's still a dissociation, and that appears in their own paper. If you look at the conduction aphasics, they are not expressive agrammatics, but they show the pattern on the receptive side. So while they clarified that there was not a dissociation in their sample with respect to receptive and expressive agrammatism, they revealed another dissociation between expressive and receptive agrammatism in the form of conduction aphasia. So that remained a problem still, even in their work. A third problem is the title of the paper from some of my colleagues here at CSTAR. Chronic Broca's aphasia is caused by damage to Broca's and Wernicke's area. So this is interesting. If people with classic chronic Broca's aphasia, many of which will be agrammatic, have damage to Wernicke's area, then that opens the door to the possibility that their comprehension problem that was being studied in the Karamatsa and Zurov paper was actually due to posterior damage, whereas the expressive agrammatism was due to damage in the frontal lobe. And indeed, another study that Sigfus led concluded that damage to the posterior middle temporal gyrus was the strongest predictor for overall task performance on non-canonical sentences and performance on non-canonical sentences. So again, pointing to the idea that receptive syntactic problems seem to be a posterior problem. The fourth problem for the overarching agrammatism idea is that grammatical ability was shown in this classic paper that was published just a few years after the Karamatsa and Zurov by Linebarger, Schwartz, and Safran, that people with agrammatic Broca's aphasia have relatively preserved grammatical ability, demonstrated by their ability to judge acceptability of grammatical of sentences. And so that suggests that they, in fact, don't have a syntactic problem, at least at some level, in contrast to the overarching claims that were being made at the time. More recently, Danielle Fahey, William Machin, and Julius and I looked at this in our sample, asking individuals to make grammaticality judgments and map the lesions associated with that. And lo and behold, not surprisingly, the problem tended to be associated with posterior lesions. All right, so Interim conclusion. Yes, of course, aphasia is a linguistics problem. The revolution that was created by generative linguistics is important and relevant to aphasia and to understanding the neural architecture of language. So, of course, we need to think about and understand deficits that occur at different linguistic levels. Aphasia is a linguistics problem, but we can't throw out the idea at the same time that it isn't also a receptive expressive problem. So that motivates the need to integrate these. And the next question is, how do we integrate them? So I'm going to start with some additional facts. The first is that each level of linguistic representation involves both anterior and posterior regions. This is demonstrated here quite simply with a neurosynth meta-analysis on the terms phonological and syntactic. And you can see that you get regions associated with both syntactic and phonological levels, semantic as well, in anterior areas as well as posterior areas. So all these areas are involved in different levels. This is not a particularly new claim. Peter Hagort, for example, has discussed this quite a bit in some of his work. So that's one fact. Another fact is that expressive disruption can result from anterior or posterior insult. And to demonstrate that, this isn't terribly controversial either. Wernicke was quite aware of this, and it was part of his theory. But just to give you some modern evidence that this is the case, here's one example of word production deficits caused by direct cortical stimulation. Here's all in a multi-site paper that came out in 21. These are all the different sites that induced anomia of various sorts. That's either speech errors or an inability to produce the words in a context of of otherwise fluent speech. Here's the density map, and you can see clearly our classic language areas, both of them being involved in word production, and a cluster analysis showing the same thing. Here's a demonstration of this at the morphosyntactic level. So this is a study that William Machen and I worked on together with a group of our C-STAR colleagues, trying to look at the neural correlates of two different types of expressive grammatical deficits. One, the familiar one that's been studied extensively, agrammatism, and the one that has been neglected since the 80s, essentially, paragrammatism, which is well known to be associated with Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia, of course, is associated with posterior lesions, so we kind of figured that paragrammatism would be related to posterior areas. When you actually do the measurements, you end up with cleanly dissociated lesion correlates of the two types of syntactic deficits. One anterior, agrammatism, like you'd expect, and one more posterior, associated with paragrammatism. So you get essentially both frontal and posterior language areas involved in expressive function. A third point is that receptive disruption is predominantly found with posterior damage. So here's examples from single word comprehension, two different studies showing temporal lobe correlates. Here's another example for sentence comprehension from two different studies, sentence picture matching, plausibility judgments of a variety of sorts. This is particularly non-canonical sentences, which are the ones that are supposed to be disrupted in agrammatic Broca's aphasia and so on. So you get, again, posterior involvement, but not so much anterior involvement like you see in the expressive function. So taken together, if you look at these results, what you conclude, at least preliminarily, is that there may be overarching deficits, but they're not in anterior areas like Karamazov and Zurov thought. They are in posterior language areas, and this is something that, again, William looked into, directly comparing expressive grammatical function and receptive grammatical function, and you can see that there's not overlap in the receptive and the expressive in the frontal lobes, but there is in the posterior temporal areas. Another recent study reinforced this. This is a meta-analysis of 25 lesion symptom mapping studies. They looked at expressive receptive overlap and found that not in the frontal lobe, but in the temporal lobe, this kind of pink area here. All right, so this is what I call the expressive receptive asymmetry, which is that at each linguistic level, Dorsal stream damage mostly produces expressive deficits, and you can ask me questions about receptive agrammatism and frontal lobe involvement, like in imaging studies in the question section. But mostly you get expressive deficits at all levels. And with ventral stream damage, in contrast, you get both receptive and expressive deficits. So this is an asymmetry with respect to anterior versus posterior lesions, producing expressive versus receptive disruption. Okay, so this is where sensory motor control comes in. So I kind of want to shift gears. That what I presented so far is the argument for there being a need to integrate and sensory motor function or expressive receptive asymmetry with linguistic levels. So sensory motor control. If we look at sensory motor control in general and in speech processing in particular, we see a ready-made mechanism and architecture to explain expressive receptive asymmetries, and that is feedback control. So this makes intuitive sense if we think about general motor control. If you're reaching for your phone that's sitting on the desk in front of you, you're going to need sensory information to guide your reach and your grasp. You need to know where it is in space, you need to know its size, its shape, and you need to know its orientation so you can generate an appropriate grasp for that object. The same is true in speech. Um, uh, Feedback control, of course, this is the concept of feedback control, which is that motor planning depends on sensory targets. It also occurs in speech, and this is studied most often with altered auditory feedback paradigms. Here, the basic idea is you have people vocalize. They can say a word like bed, or they can phonate a vowel. And then what you do is you record that output, you digitally manipulate it and alter it and feed it back to the participant in real time while they're speaking. And you look to see that how that affects that auditory feedback, that sensory feedback affects their speech production. And what you find, so typically what people study is F0 shift, which is shifting the fundamental, the pitch of the voice, versus the other one that's mainly studied is F1 shift, which shifts the vowel quality and can shift the category. So what you find, and this is an example from one study that we did in aphasia. This is work with Ruzba Baruzman. This is the typical kind of compensation. What happens is if you shift F0, which is what we did here, the shift was going up. And what will happen is within about 100 milliseconds, people will compensate for that shift, producing their voice shift in the other direction to compensate for what they hear themselves saying that didn't match the target. So what this suggests is that people, when they hear altered auditory feedback, that sensory information drives changes in motor plans. That's feedback control, which is consistent with the idea that motor planning is grounded in sensory targets. Um, this study was actually aimed at looking at this phenomenon in aphasia, and this is the behavioral data overall. People with aphasia show less of a response, compensation response. And interestingly, the lesion location that is associated with the amplitude of the response is a posterior sensory related area. Okay, so we can start looking then at sensory motor control architectures. This is a feedback control architecture from John Hood and Sri Nagarajan, and it looks a little scary. There's a lot of math in there, and there's a bunch of components and arrows and boxes and all sorts of things. But it's not that scary. So let me just kind of walk you through it. The basic design is that you have a sensory target, which is the sensory representation of what you're trying to say. You have a motor plan for hitting that target. You have a kind of translation system in between. So if you want to produce a particular word like cat, you have a motor plan for hitting that plan, and you have a target. If you produce it, you can, this is an external feedback loop. You can compare what you actually said with the target, and if there's an error in that, you can then generate a correction. There's also an internal feedback loop, which is essentially a way of checking the motor plan against the target that you're trying to hit. So you can think of this as kind of a motor plan sensory target system. I can simplify this architecture for you in this way. So this is basically the idea. Here's your targets. Here's your motor plans for hitting those targets. This is an internal feedback loop. The external feedback loop is here. And you have a translation system in between that is basically translating a sensory representation of the speech sound that you're trying to generate into a motor plan and vice versa. The usefulness of this internal feedback loop is that it allows you, while you're doing planning, to make sure that you are going to hit the target. And this is a kind of internal feedback loop that allows you to do that. And I'll give you an example of why we think that exists in a minute. So these targets could be a particular pitch or a F1, F2 ratio or something like that, a vowel that you're trying to hit. So this is fairly well accepted at the low level speech planning level. It's less accepted at the higher level. However, at higher levels, if you look carefully, you see that this feedback control idea scales up to higher levels of linguistic representation. So here's a few bits of evidence to reinforce that claim. So one thing we know about F1 shift, for example, is that if you shift F1 such that the perceived feedback is within a phoneme category, a vowel category, people will still compensate. But if you cross a category boundary such that you're trying to say bed and you end up saying bid or something like that, the compensation response is larger. So there's something about the category change in there at the phonological level, the phonological category level, that is sensitive. This process is sensitive to linguistic information. I've argued that a feedback control architecture provides a really nice explanation for conduction aphasia, which is essentially that people with conduction aphasia have intact phonological representations of what the targets that they're trying to produce. Their motor plans for hitting those targets are also intact. But they have no way of checking, because this system is damaged by hypothesis. They have no way of checking whether the motor plans that they're generating are actually going to hit the targets that they're producing. So they're going to generate more errors. When they produce the errors, they can compute the difference between the target they were trying to hit and what they actually heard themselves say, which is characteristic of their ability to detect the errors that they produce. So it provides a nice explanation of conduction aphasia that's hard to explain otherwise. Of course, if you look back in history, Wernicke was all over this idea already in the 1800s. He was writing about sensory aphasia in this quote, noting that apart from his deficient comprehension, the patient has aphasic manifestations in speaking because of the absence of the corrective function exercised unconsciously by the sound images. These manifestations consist in the tendency readily to confuse words. So basically, this is Wernicke discussing a feedback control mechanism. Another reason, bit of evidence showing that this scales up is in psycholinguistics. Straight up psycholinguistic research has also identified external and internal feedback control. There it's called self-monitoring, but it is essentially the same thing. So this is a redrawing of a figure by Indiffery and Levelt showing these self-monitoring loops, one internal and one external. The operation of these internal feedback loops has been demonstrated psycholinguistically in a couple of ways. One, from slips of the tongue research. One is slips like this, where someone will be describing something and they'll say horizontal. And the reason why this suggests internal feedback control is because there's not enough time, if you heard the V, to detect the error and correct it before you produce the next vowel. And clearly what's happening here is people are slipping out a little bit, but they've already detected it and the correction just comes a little bit later. So this is a time-based bit of evidence. There's more evidence from taboo words effects. So you can induce slips of the tongue by giving people lists of words to say with similar phonemes, and people will make slips. One observation from a while back is that if the induced slip results in a taboo word, like a swear word, people will generate fewer slips than comparable items that don't result in a taboo word. So apparently, internally, these taboo words, which have higher salience, are being detected and corrected more frequently. We actually did a study on this, taboo words. So here's examples taken from other work of tongue twisters. So you have people read these things, and what will happen is the first sound will tend to get swapped of the first word, will tend to get swapped with the first sound on the third word. And then you can design these so that you end up, if you do that swap, you end up saying taboo words that, and for those of you who are old enough to remember the 7 words you can't say on television bit by George Carlin, essentially what we're doing in this paradigm is challenging our subjects not to do a George Carlin bit in the scanner. What do we see? So what we did is compared taboo trials with control trials in non-error trials only. So we were interested in trials that did not produce an error, did not produce a slip, on the assumption that there will be more correction with the more salient taboo words, leading to higher activation in the systems involved in that. And we found posterior middle temporal gyrus activation for taboo compared to controls, which we interpret as internal feedback control at a higher level, at the lexical level. So we're seeing this scale up to the lexical level in terms of this kind of feedback control architecture. And you can compare the neural architecture of this, which is a higher level on the sensory side, compared to F0 or F1 shift, which is a lower level in the auditory system. All right. So from this, we can kind of generalize a linguistic sensory motor model. So you have different linguistic levels represented in the vertical dimension here. So you have low-level motor control, you have phonological level control, and you have morphosyntactic control. And then you have the sensory motor architecture where each level is organized in terms of sensory-like targets, motor-like plans for hitting those targets, and a translation system in between. So this is the basic idea of the linguistic sensory motor model, that the architecture that is well accepted in low-level sensory motor control generally, including in speech motor control, scales up to linguistic levels, okay? So to be a little bit more explicit about some of the ideas here, the idea of the LSM model is that language is a species of sensory motor control in terms of its neurocomputational architecture. That is, each level has sensory targets, motor plans for hitting those targets, and a translation system in between. Internal and external feedback control operates at all levels, where the internal feedback control is part of the planning process to make sure that the motor-like plans that you're generating will actually hit the targets. And the sensory side supports receptive function. So that's the expressive-receptive asymmetry. Now, this is easy to misunderstand. And when I've said these things in the past, people misunderstand what I'm actually trying to say. So I'm going to clarify here. The claim is that language has a homologous architecture to sensory motor control circuits. That is, it's derived from a common neurocomputational ancestor in terms of its evolution, its original evolution, and therefore shares a basic design, not that it is the same or that one reduces to the other. So I'm not saying that morphosyntax or phonology reduces to sensory motor control and we don't need to study morphosyntax or phonology anymore. I'm just saying that the architecture is homologous. So by analogy, homologous in the evolutionary sense, of course. By analogy, humans are a species of ape. We share a common ancestor and therefore a wide range of traits. This does not mean, however, that humans are reducible to chimps, obviously. We have specialized systems that they don't have, even though they're embedded in similar kinds of architectures, at least neurally. Okay. So that's that. Now, this is, I would say, less controversial at the phonological level, but it is more controversial at the syntactic level. So when I put this out on Blue Sky a little while ago, saying language is a species of sensory motor control architecture, William said yes, but no. And I want to admit, so we'll deal with this a little bit later. But I want to say, first of all, that I was quite skeptical that higher levels, the morphosyntactic levels, could fit in this architecture. I suspected it would. So for example, when I was generating this model that I called a hierarchical state feedback control model, which basically took the work that I had done at the phonological level and added a lower level that involved somatosensory targets and lower level motor plans in the cerebellum, kind of expanding this hierarchical architecture of sensory motor control. I drew it also with the word or lemma level and a conceptual system. And as I looked at this lemma level, which is kind of the morphosyntactic level, right? I wondered whether this should have the same architecture as these. I didn't have the arguments at the time to do that, so I didn't. But since then we've done some work, in fact, with William, to suggest that the yes part of William's claim that yes, it does have a sensory motor architecture, does exist, that there is something that makes sense about a kind of sensory motor architecture at the level of morphosyntax. So what is that yes part? The yes part is, like I've said, it does exhibit an expressive receptive asymmetry, which I pointed out before. And this is neatly accounted for in terms of a sensory motor architecture, where the targets, so we kind of went into the syntax, linguistic syntax, and looked at different operations or components of syntax to try to figure out which components of syntax might serve as the targets, which might serve as the plans for hitting those targets. And what we came up with is this, that on the sensory side, in the posterior middle temporal gyrus, what's being coded is some sort of hierarchical representation at the level of morphosyntax. So something like, however it's implemented in the brain, something like a tree structure that doesn't have any inherent order in it. So think of this as a child's mobile, in a crib, where you have a bunch of toys dangling from these kinds of hanger things, and they're just kind of rotating around. There's no inherent order. So that is the hierarchical representation of the utterance that's going to be generated. And the job of the motor side of the system is to generate a linearized sequence of morphemes that, when recovered by the listener, will allow the listener to reconstruct the hierarchy. So that's the idea we came up with, that damage to posterior areas damages the hierarchical representations and produces paragrammatism, because you're just not able to represent the target quite well, and all you're doing is generating pre-learned sequences and mashing them together, and you get these so-called sentence monsters. You also, because you've damaged the system, the receptive function is going to be disrupted, because you're not able to recover the hierarchies, and you're going to end up with a kind of grammatical deficit on the receptive side as well. When you damage this system, you end up with difficulty sequencing these morphemes linearly, aka grammatism, while receptive function is relatively intact. So I think it does fit quite nice, this view with a sensory motor architecture. Okay, so in the diagram that William and I put together for that paper, we just had a single connection between the sensory side and the motor side. But I've been telling you that there is an in-between, a transform in between. This has been well studied at the phonological level, where the work that my students and I have done on SPT at the posterior part of the planum temporale seems to be the interface for computing the relation between sensory-related phonological codes and motor-related phonological codes. But this one is a little bit less studied, in fact, quite less studied. But just to summarize this broader picture, again, this is the linguistic structure. Here is the sensory motor structure. And the shaded areas are the regions involved in comprehension. The production network is outlined by this dotted outline here, and the difference between damage to frontal and posterior areas gives you this expressive receptive asymmetry. For those who care about syndromes anymore, and some of us don't in many cases, but they do kind of hang together, so it's useful to know that we can explain different kinds of deficits, classic deficits in aphasia, as resulting from damage to these different streams. You get expressive agrammatism, you get word deafness and paraphasic errors, damage to this system if you damage it bilaterally. Receptive agrammatism with paragrammatism if you damage this system. You get phonological conduction aphasia here, as I explained. But then this one is a bit of a puzzle and hasn't been studied. The model would predict that there should be some kind of morphosyntactic conduction aphasia. That is, a kind of expressive paragrammatism on the expressive side, like a conduction aphasic having difficulty producing phonological word forms, but with spared receptive function. In the case of paragrammatism, this paragrammatism, we should see spared comprehension. So a recent grad from my lab, Jeremy Yaton, who also worked extensively with William, had studied this in our C-STAR database, identifying patients who showed this pattern. And he identified 7 cases of people with paragrammatism who had poor comprehension. And you can see that their lesions tend to be temporal lobe underneath and including the middle temporal gyrus. And then he identified 8 cases who were paragrammatic in their output but had good comprehension. And you can see that that focus is gone. It's a little bit more anterior, a little bit deeper, probably affecting white matter pathways and so on. So there's some evidence that there is a kind of morphosyntactic conduction aphasia, which the model predicts. There's more evidence for there being some sort of an intermediate between the middle temporal gyrus morphosyntactic system and the anterior linearization system. A while back, David Galp proposed what he called the dual lexicon model. This is a figure from his paper. This is a kind of Hickok and Popple-like dual stream model, but at the lexical level, whereas David Popple and I talked about sublexical dorsal stream. Gao talks about a lexical dorsal stream, so something higher level representing an interface between frontal motor systems and posterior sensory systems. And that was based on a review of all sorts of different sources of evidence. More recently, Kathy Price's group has looked at supramarginal gyrus parcellation, trying to identify subcomponents of the supramarginal gyrus. Of interest to us here is this blue zone, which they argue is a lexical subzone of the supramarginal gyrus. So something outside the traditional language network in terms of inferior frontal versus middle temporal gyrus, superior temporal gyrus, but doing something lexical, which is interesting. It could serve as a morphosyntactic interface. So there is, I would say, suggestive evidence for something like a morphosyntactic transform in the inferior parietal lobe. All right, so let's go a bit beyond the core architecture of language, which is what I'm arguing that this is. This is like the basic architecture. We can do better, and I'm not going to talk about it, but just to let you know, like I said, we can expand at the phonological level and below, we can expand the different hierarchical levels there. Recently, I've been working on parceling out 2 separate hierarchies of speech motor control. One kind of prosodic and pitch related in the dorsal region, the middle frontal gyrus, compared to the more traditional ventral one, which is more morphosyntactic, phonological, and phonetic. So that's going to be further kind of sensory motor loops. And then we can get into the details of the functional anatomy, and I'm not going to kind of walk you through everything here, but this is kind of where I ended up in the book with respect to the functional anatomy of the whole system, and I'll just orient you to how this is organized. So the different colored boxes refer to different anatomical areas. The words inside give you the functions. The colors are functional connectivity. So pink areas are connected, functionally connected to each other. And it's kind of organized. Let me back up or go forward. It's organized in terms of their anatomical location. So if this is the Sylvian fissure, here is the superior temporal sulcus, inferior temporal sulcus, central sulcus, precentral sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus, and there's kind of where these things live in the brain. So it's kind of organized in that way. The colors are based on Alex Tekhipko's dissertation functional connectivity map. So just to let you know where these colors come from. And in here you can see kind of the ventral stream and the dorsal stream here. The ventral stream is where the targets are coded for speech motor planning and for comprehension. Here's your sensory motor interface systems. Here is the dorsal and ventral frontal areas involved in prosodic versus more traditional levels, and so on. So I'm not going to go into detail about this, but just to let you know that we can, and I think we are in a position to say more about the architecture of the system beyond that basic core architecture. So we can identify four principles of the LSM. So just to kind of summarize. Sensory motor systems are hierarchically organized, as are language systems. I think this is completely uncontroversial. No surprise here. But number two is where things we kind of merge them. All levels of linguistic processing are organized in a way that's homologous to a sensory motor neurocomputational architecture. And this comes from its common ancestor in terms of the evolution of these systems. This is a nice result because it does allow us to think about, provides us with some continuity between non-linguistic and linguistic systems in terms of the neurocomputational architecture, which gives us a better way of thinking about how these systems might have evolved. Different portions of the sensory motor architectures are engaged in a task-dependent fashion, meaning basically the expressive-receptive asymmetry, depending on whether you're producing or comprehending, you get different loads on different parts of the system. And finally, although not necessarily required for a sensory motor-like architecture, another claim that I'm making is that different components of these networks vary in their degree of laterality at the population and individual level. So in the last 10 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit about lateralization. One point I want to make is that lateralization varies from system to system. This I don't think is particularly controversial. Most people who work with aphasia will agree that in general, expressive function is a bit more lateralized, more consistently disrupted than receptive function. It's something that's been recognized for quite a while. But I'll emphasize that in a sec. The more controversial and interesting claims are that I think we're overestimating the strength of lateralization in general, including receptive and expressive function. And I'm not sure that we're thinking about it correctly, or at least I wasn't thinking about it correctly. So let me just kind of go back and talk about the strength of the lateralization. And I'm going to use speech perception as a test case. Now, as I said, speech perception is probably the least lateralized function, but it serves as a useful test case for thinking about lateralization in general, because we know a fair amount about it. People historically have been pretty convinced that speech perception is a left dominant function. So the giants of neurology say that speech perception is a function of the left hemisphere, of Wernicke's area in particular. So for example, Kleist said, word deafness is the result of disease of the first left temporal convolution. Geschwin said, pure word deafness probably results from the disconnection of Wernicke's area, which is of course left hemisphere, from auditory stimulation. These ideas persist in modern researchers. So Roschecker and Scott claim that speech perception, as well as production, are left lateralized in the human brain. However, when you start looking at data, there's reason to question this in terms of a strong left dominance. So here's a study, some images that Corianne Rogalski put together based on our database, which includes some of the C-star data. 24 cases of chronic left superior temporal lobe cases, lesion cases. This is lesion overlap, showing lots of overlap, nothing much going on in the frontal lobe. You give them a word comprehension task where they just hear a word like bear, and they're asked to point to the picture where you have phonological and semantic and unrelated foils. The average performance in these cases where the critical areas would seem to be damaged, at least in some, is 97.9% correct. The lowest score is 90%, and only two of them had that score. This is kind of surprising if the claim is that the left superior temporal gyrus or middle temporal gyrus is critical for comprehension, for speech perception. So what this shows us is that chronic unilateral damage to these regions doesn't typically cause severe or even moderate word comprehension deficits, doesn't typically cause it. Not that it can't cause it. I've always been confronted when presenting this sort of thing with plastic reorganization. Yeah, well, it's left dominant, but then after recovery, the right hemisphere takes over. So here's a study with my colleagues, again, C-star colleagues, Melissa Stockbridge led this up, studying acute stroke and doing a similar task, picture verification now. So we're computing D prime, discriminability between matches and mismatches. And here's the data. these three lines correspond to different amounts of damage in the superior and middle temporal gyrus. So this critical zone, less damage, more damage, the most damage. This is D prime, so this is threshold. This is 2 standard deviations above chance, 3 standard deviations, and 4 standard deviations above chance. This is ceiling. Okay, so we're looking at the red curve here, and what I want you to notice is that the 50% of the population level have a line that extends out here performing perfectly. So less than half of all cases made any errors at all on this task. And you don't start seeing severe deficit. Many of these people have only mild deficits. This is roughly 96% correct, almost 90% correct. So we're talking about 25 to 30% of the people who have notable deficits on this, which is much lower than you'd expect if this was the zone for speech perception. So if these results are true, why do we think that it is more strongly left dominant than it is? So many of us still think that speech perception is relatively strongly left dominant, and I'm going to suggest 2 possibilities. One is sampling bias, which is when we study these things, at least in the clinic, we generally recruit based on the presence of aphasia, which is going to miss all those cases with lesions in these areas that have no effects on their linguistic ability. The other is availability bias. In fact, we do see many severe cases with left hemisphere, but not right hemisphere damage. And so that makes us think that, yes, this exists and it's left dominant just because of availability. These are prominent cases. So that's basically the argument for the strength of the effect is probably less strong than we think. Do we need to rethink lateralization? And I'm going to use speech perception with WADA as my test case here. This is me literally perceiving speech with WADA. I met him back in 2017. But of course, I'm talking about the procedure that he invented. So here's the same task that we use in stroke. 20 people undergoing WADA procedures, left anesthesia, right anesthesia baseline. This is proportion of errors. So lower is better. Phonemic errors is the black bar. What I want to point out is that less than 10% of people make phonological error, or less than the error rate on average is less than 10%. Okay. So what I want to ask, so this again is consistent with the idea that speech perception isn't as left dominant as we think, since the phonological error rate is quite low, even with the left hemisphere completely deactivated acutely. I want to ask this question though. What does this mean? And there's 2 ways you can think about this result. One is that everyone leans left 10%. So all of us will have 10% left dominance. Okay, so some asymmetry. The other way to think about it is that 10% of people lean left. Okay, and that makes a difference. If 10% of people lean left, then that means that left dominance is atypical. So it's not the norm. Okay, so the framing matters here. So with this thinking in mind, I went back to the WADA data that we had collected, and instead of just looking at the average performance with left and right anesthesia, I computed a difference score. So I compared in each person left versus right anesthesia, and I plotted the distribution of where people fall on this difference score. This is for phonological errors. This is for semantic errors. So what I want to point out is that if you're completely left dominant, you're way down here. Completely right dominant, you're way up here. If you're completely symmetric, same amount of errors left and right, then you're right in the middle. And what you notice is that vast majority of the sample, 90%, is pretty much right in the middle. There are only about 10% that are showing problems, more significant problems. The distribution is a little more left skewed at the semantic level, which is consistent with the claim that different levels have different lateralization patterns. But I think this is instructive, at least it was for me, thinking about lateralization in terms of population distributions at the individual level. The way I interpret this is that most people are symmetric, and it is atypical for people to be left dominant. But when you do fMRI studies or you do other kinds of studies and you look at group averages and correlations, you'll find a correlation with the left hemisphere because it does lean left in some people, it doesn't lean right in as many people. And so you're looking at the left dominance that you're seeing in these group average studies is essentially what's being contributed by very minor biases in some people and larger biases in a couple of people, in a smaller group of people. So most people are symmetric, at least on this level. And that's true here too, remember? So most people are symmetric or at least don't have problems with damage to these critical areas. So lateralization conclusions, do we need to rethink it? Yes, I would argue. We're probably overestimating left dominance for language generally. So I do think that other functions like speech production, various aspects of it are more left dominant. We won't see these kinds of patterns as much, but I still think we're overestimating it. Some abilities like speech perception are only atypically left dominant. And we need to think in terms of lateralization distributions rather than group averages. And I think that's a good place to stop. So I will stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Greg. I don't think you heard, but it was a big applause for you. I hadn't taken off. No, I hadn't opened for the audio before everybody applauded. But
Well, thank you.
thank you so much. Let's take a couple of questions. We've got a few minutes. Maybe if we have a question in the room. William, go for it.
I was trying to hold off because we've talked about these things before in other contexts. So, Greg, thank you as always. Very stimulating, interesting. But I think we have this fundamental difference of looking at it. Like I think you see the linguistic levels in some way as parasitic on the sensory motor organization, whereas I think I see it the other way around. That the sensory motor organization is parasitic on the linguistic or the generally cognitive like functions of these systems, right? So what I think of is like the frontal lobe is instantiating linearization operations. And what do those happen to be good for? Well, that happens to be useful in a lot of contexts when you need to speak, but it doesn't happen to be as critical for situations of comprehension. And so like I would sort of, if I were to write your book, Greg, I would say I would say the opposite way around, right? That like, production and comprehension, those are sort of emergent functions that just take advantage of certain abstract computations that the brain does. And they just happen to be useful more for one case than the other. Like I was in my head, I was thinking, when I was in high school, like I live in this town that is like very steep in sort of near the mountains, right? So my parents would give me a ride. Actually, that's not really relevant. But my point is that my parents would give me a ride in the morning to work, to school, but I would walk home in the afternoon. So if you look at the behavior, you would say, oh, well, cars are for going to school and legs are for going home. But really, it just happened to be convenient that that's the way it worked out, right? There's cars and legs that have these generalized, functions that could be applied to both domains. It just happens to be the case that one is useful in one situation and one is useful for the other, right? So I'm just curious, how really tight are you holding to this sensory motor grounding for these systems?
Yeah, so I knew you would ask me questions, and so I didn't include it in the talk, but I did include some slides for you, William. So William says yes, but no, and I pushed him on that, and eventually he said, my biggest complaint with the claim language is a species of sensory motor control architecture is that certain aspects of language have nothing whatsoever to do with sensory motor control and were not actually modifications of a sensory motor system. So this statement is, in the strict sense, false. Okay, I pushed him on what he means by certain aspects of language, and the response was recursive combinatorial structure that is oriented around semantics using atoms that are not determined by sensory motor properties, which translates to, I think Chomsky's position on this issue is basically right. There is a novel combinatorial system primarily geared towards thought meaning, which is then parasitic on sensory motor systems for communication. So if I go back to this slide, let me just back up. So basically what William is saying, correct me if I'm wrong, William, is that you have these recursive or kind of the core features of syntax that aren't sensory motor. And I agree with that. but you're saying they're more tied to semantics. So for me, what that means is that you're not really talking about language as the same thing that I'm talking about language. So here's a semantic system in blue. Um, the rough characterization here is that you have something like event semantics and entity semantics in these two different areas here. And then you have another semantic thing in the middle. So my conjecture, and I don't think the evidence is super strong for this, but one idea is that as we evolve the capacity to do combinatorics at the semantic level, this system developed in terms of doing stuff like combinatorial semantics and maybe recursion, and it assesses, let's suppose Chomsky's right, that these early stages that led to recursion and some of the detailed computations in syntax preceded language as we have it now. Once you got to the point where you could think in these combinatorial terms, then you need to translate it into something useful for communication. So then you evolve the ability to represent hierarchies abstractly and then linearize them and so on. So I don't think I necessarily disagree with you. I just think we're talking about different things. For me, language, and for Chomsky, I think language, the core aspects of syntax, are this little teeny operation in this little part, whereas all the stuff we're studying in aphasia and in functional imaging are mostly these interface systems, as you would call them. I think that those are the core aspects of language, where language is basically translating between thoughts, however complex they end up being, and the outside world. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's, I think.
I have like just maybe a brief follow-up is to say a lot of these conclusions I think that you're drawing about the sensory motor asymmetries are driven from the kinds of tasks that we use in aphasia assessment, which are, these are fairly coarse measurements, right? You're looking at like what can you accomplish to a certain degree of performance on this task, but not necessarily are there impairments. Like, so for example, the fact that comprehension deficits, as we assess them, are associated with temporal lobe doesn't mean that if you tested comprehension in a much more subtle and communicatively realistic way, you might actually see lesion correlates in frontal lobe for things that are demanding and require more rapid computations or require you to revise your analysis of the input by analyzing the sequence of information, right? So, are your conclusions being driven by measures which are not well designed to capture sort of realistic aspects of language processing?
Okay, so we need better measures to test your hypothesis.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't have them yet. So I'm going to
No.
stick with what the evidence currently supports.
Good.
But yeah, I mean, in principle, I mean, any theory is a hypothesis, right? And if it's a good theory, it can be falsified. So absolutely, we need to look for something that suggests that these frontal areas are part of a core aspect of syntax that's overarching, or whatever take we want to impose on it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for lively discussions. We're at the point where we unfortunately need to conclude, but there are a couple of questions in the chat box, and I'll make sure to copy those and send them to you, and maybe those conversations can continue online. But thank you so much, Greg. This was a really fantastic talk. We really appreciate it. And thanks to all of our both online and in-person audience for watching and asking questions. So we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you all.